Hollywood has always been a place where the camera lies. It turns ordinary people into legends, transforms flawed human beings into symbols of grace and glamour, and packages the messy, chaotic reality of creative labor into something that looks effortless on screen. But behind every golden image is a story that nobody was supposed to tell. Ron Howard has spent more than 6 decades inside that machine, and what he witnessed along the way would shock the millions of fans who grew up watching little Opie Taylor skip down the streets of Mayberry. Howard is one of the most beloved figures in the entertainment industry. He is the rare individual who made a seamless, successful transition from child actor to A-list director, a man who helmed films like Apollo 13, A Beautiful Mind, and Cinderella Man, while maintaining a reputation for decency, professionalism, and genuine warmth. People trust Ron Howard. They believe in him. And that is precisely why, when he speaks about the darker corners of his career, the world listens very carefully. Because what Ron Howard has revealed over the years, through interviews, his memoir, and candid conversations, is that staying at the top for 6 decades requires something far beyond kindness. It requires survival instincts. It requires the ability to absorb enormous psychological pressure from some of the most difficult, complex, and frankly terrifying personalities Hollywood has ever produced. These are the actors who tested him, shaped him, and in some cases nearly broke him. To the millions of American families who gathered around their television sets during the 1960s, Frances Bavier was a living embodiment of warmth. As Aunt Bee on The Andy Griffith Show, she served hot meals, offered gentle wisdom, and radiated the kind of maternal comfort that felt like a warm blanket on a cold evening. For young Ronnie Howard, who played her nephew Opie, working alongside her should have been a dream. Instead, it was his first and most jarring lesson in the vast distance between a character and the person playing them. Bavier was not Aunt Bee. She was a classically trained New York stage actress with decades of serious theatrical work behind her, and she carried that pedigree like a shield against the rural simplicity of Mayberry. She had not fought her way through the competitive world of dramatic theater to spend her later years playing a woman whose greatest concern was whether her pickles won a ribbon at the county fair. The resentment she felt was real, and it seeped into every interaction on set. Howard has recalled in his memoir, The Boys, written alongside his brother Clint, that Bavier was not a woman who participated in the laughter and camaraderie that defined the show's famous atmosphere. While Andy Griffith and Don Knotts were improvising, joking, and building the kind of loose, joyful energy that would define the series for generations, Bavier stood apart. She was rigid. She was formal. She was, by most accounts, deeply unhappy. For a child performer, this created a unique and disorienting challenge. Howard was old enough to sense the emotional temperature of a room, but young enough to be genuinely confused by it. He was performing love and warmth with a woman who offered him polite distance at best and visible irritation at worst. He had to learn, at an age when most children are worrying about schoolwork, that the intimacy you see on screen is sometimes a complete fabrication, a performance of connection between two people who share no genuine connection at all. The lessons Howard drew from Bavier stayed with him throughout his directing career. He learned that talent and happiness do not always coexist. He learned that a person can deliver a technically excellent performance while being consumed by internal misery. And perhaps most importantly, he learned that the director's job is not just to capture good performances, but to understand a human being producing them, even when that human being has constructed walls so high they seem impossible to scale. Bavier retired to North Carolina in her later years, becoming increasingly reclusive and declining most requests to participate in cast reunions. She died in 1989, having reconciled somewhat with her legacy, but never fully at peace with it. Howard has spoken of her with something that sounds like compassion wrapped around sadness, acknowledging that a woman of her gifts deserved more than a career defined by a character she secretly resented. If Frances Bavier taught a young Ron Howard about the coldness of professional resentment, Yul Brynner taught him something far more primal, the absolute, suffocating power of an unchecked ego operating at full force. Howard was only 5 years old when he encountered Brynner on the set of the 1959 film The Journey, and yet the experience left an impression so deep it shaped his entire philosophy of leadership decades later. Brynner was not simply a famous actor. He was, in his own mind, in the minds of the studio system that created him, something closer to royalty. His shaved head, his booming voice, his legendary portrayal of the King of Siam and The King and I had elevated him to a status that existed somewhere above ordinary stardom. He did not arrive on set as a colleague. He arrived as a sovereign, and everyone else on the production was expected to behave accordingly. For a 5-year-old child, encountering this kind of presence was not just intimidating, it was genuinely frightening. Howard is described feeling as though the air changed when Brenner entered a room, as though some fundamental law of gravity had been altered. Brenner did not make eye contact in the way that most people do. He looked through people rather than at them, a technique designed to communicate that you were not quite real enough to deserve his full attention. What made this so formative for Howard was watching how the adults around Brenner responded. These were seasoned professionals, men and women who had worked on dozens of films and accumulated years of experience. And yet in Brenner's presence, they scrambled. They adjusted. They bent themselves into shapes designed to avoid his disapproval. Howard watched as an entire crew subordinated their own personalities and professional instincts to the demands of one man's ego, and he filed that observation away for future reference. When Howard became a director, he built his sets in conscious opposition to everything Brenner represented. He is famously egalitarian on set, known for remembering the names of crew members, for creating an atmosphere where questions are encouraged and mistakes are treated as information rather than failures. Every time he chose to lead through collaboration rather than intimidation, the ghost of Yul Brynner was somewhere in the background, serving as a definitive example of what not to do. By 1982, Ron Howard was no longer a child navigating the terrain of other people's greatness. He was a young director trying to establish his own authority, and his film Night Shift represented his chance to prove that he belonged behind the camera as much as he had ever belonged in front of it. What he did not anticipate was that one of his lead actresses would turn the production into a daily exercise in philosophical negotiation. Shelley Long was brilliant. That much was never in dispute. Her background at Chicago Second City had given her a rigorous intellectual approach to character work, and her instincts as a comedic actress were genuinely exceptional. But her process was painstaking in a way that created constant friction with Howard's instinct for momentum and efficiency. She wanted to understand not just what her character said, but why. At a molecular level, those particular words had been chosen. Every scene was a seminar. Every take was an opportunity for deeper analysis. Howard, who had grown up in the high-efficiency world of television production where time is money and momentum is everything, found himself in the unexpected position of managing a performer whose intellectual rigor was simultaneously her greatest strength and her most disruptive quality. She was not being difficult out of vanity or spite. She was being difficult because she genuinely believed that the work demanded it, and that belief made her almost impossible to argue with. The experience forced Howard to develop what might be called his theory of productive friction. He realized that the director's job is not simply to keep things moving, but to determine which moments of resistance are worth honoring and which are self-indulgent. Long's perfectionism did ultimately produce a nuanced, vulnerable performance that elevates Night Shift significantly. But the cost of that performance was measured in delays, tensions, and the kind of exhausting daily negotiation that leaves everyone on set slightly depleted. Howard emerged from Night Shift with a clearer sense of his own authority. He had learned that being a nice person and being a decisive leader are not mutually exclusive, but that the second quality is not optional. A director who cannot hold his ground against a strong personality will lose control of the entire production, not because a strong personality is malicious, but simply because nature abhors a vacuum, and egos will expand to fill whatever space is available. There are difficult actors, and then there's Russell Crowe. By the time Howard cast him in A Beautiful Mind, Crowe was already one of the most celebrated and simultaneously most feared performers in the industry. His talent was beyond question. His temperament was legendary, and his approach to creative work was so intense, so absolute, so completely uncompromising that working alongside him required a specific kind of psychological endurance that most directors simply did not possess. Crowe did not inhabit roles so much as he consumed them. When he took on the character of John Nash, the brilliant and tormented mathematician at the center of A Beautiful Mind, he brought a ferocity to the work that demanded the entire production bend to its requirements. He asked hard questions, challenged script choices, debated directorial decisions, and pushed back against anything he felt was less than completely truthful. Howard has described managing Crowe as one of the most demanding creative relationships of his career, a high-stakes partnership that required constant vigilance and genuine intellectual courage. One of the most revealing episodes in the production involved Crowe's insistence on shooting the film in chronological order, a logistical challenge that would complicate the schedule and increase costs significantly. Howard's initial instinct was to resist, to explain that modern filmmaking is essentially a mosaic assembled out of sequence, and that professional actors are trained to handle that reality. But Crowe was persistent, and his argument was substantive. He believed that the psychological deterioration of John Nash could not be genuinely portrayed if he was jumping back and forth through the character's timeline. He needed to live the decline in real time. Howard listened, and then Howard pivoted. He recognized in that moment something important. Crowe was not fighting for control. He was fighting for truth. And a director who cannot recognize the difference between an ego-demanding submission and a talent demanding honesty does not deserve to be in a room with Russell Crowe. The film won the Academy Award for Best Picture. Their working relationship, though never easy, evolved into one of genuine mutual respect. Howard has said that the Crowe experience forced him to become a stronger, more intellectually engaged director, one who had to match the intensity of his leading man, rather than simply managing him from a comfortable distance. Not all of Hollywood's difficult personalities are defined by ego or perfectionism. Some of them are defined by pain. Tom Sizemore was one of the most genuinely talented actors of his generation, a performer capable of going toe-to-toe with Robert De Niro and Tom Hanks and holding his own completely. But by the time his path crossed with Ron Howard's world, Sizemore was in the grip of a substance abuse crisis that was systematically dismantling everything he had built. For Howard, who sets operate on a foundation of mutual respect and professional reliability, Sizemore represented a form of friction he had never encountered before and was not fully equipped to handle. This was not the friction of competing visions or clashing temperaments. This was the friction of watching a gifted person disappear in real time, of managing production around the instability of someone who could not always be counted on to show up, let alone to perform. Howard has spoken about the experience with a sadness that is distinctly different from the frustration he expresses when discussing other difficult personalities. There is no anger in how he talks about Sizemore, only a kind of grieving for potential that was never fully realized. He saw in Sizemore the clearest possible illustration of the entertainment industry's tendency to provide enormous wealth and freedom to people who are simultaneously battling enormous internal chaos and offer very little in the way of genuine support or accountability. The lesson Howard drew from Sizemore was perhaps the most personally affecting of his career. He learned that kindness, patience, and professional grace have limits, that there are situations where the most responsible thing a leader can do is protect the collective effort from the instability of one individual, even when that individual is someone you genuinely care about. It is a hard lesson, and Howard carries it with visible weight. The most complicated friction of Ron Howard's career did not come from an intimidating star or a troubled performer. It came from his best friend. Henry Winkler's portrayal of the Fonz on Happy Days became one of the defining cultural phenomena of the 1970s, and the show's rapid reorientation around Winkler's character at the expense of Howard's Richie Cunningham was, by Howard's own admission, genuinely painful. Howard has been clear that his feelings were never directed at Winkler personally. Their friendship was real, deep, and enduring. Winkler is the godfather of Howard's children. The love between them was never in question. What stung was the behavior of the network executives, who began treating Howard with a diminishing respect that reflected their changing sense of where the show's value resided. When the idea was floated of renaming the series Fonzie's Happy Days, Howard drew a clear line. He was not going to accept erasure with a smile. The decision he made in response to that situation changed the trajectory of his entire life. He realized that if the industry was going to find him as a supporting player in someone else's story, he needed to write a different story entirely. He transitioned into directing, and the rest is history that fills textbooks and award show speeches and the cultural memory of multiple generations of filmgoers. In later years, Howard and Winkler discussed this period openly, with Howard admitting that it hurt his feelings in ways he did not fully process until much later. That honesty is characteristic of him. He is a man who has always been more interested in understanding his experiences than in protecting himself from them. What he learned from the Fonz phenomenon was ultimately the most valuable lesson of all, that being overlooked is not the end of your story. It can be the beginning of a completely different and far more powerful one. Ron Howard did not become one of Hollywood's greatest directors despite the difficult personalities he encountered. He became that director because of them,